Welcome to Plan9Crunch. I'm Doug Gibson. This is Joe Gibson. And we have Jon Towlson, and he is the author of several books, including 40 cult movies. He's also written books on Candyman, Dawn of the Dead, and Midnight Cowboy, and you contributed to many essays. And you are a lecturer, a professor at University of York, right, on film?
That's right, yeah.
Okay, and you're in Los Angeles right now. And I want to talk first of all, if you don't mind, about a book coming out in September called Window on the World. And that basically tells your life growing up and going to the theater and learning about the theater in an area that didn't particularly have a lot of theater at the time and had to have people that would be involved in it and get people to see it. There was a theater called the Granada that had a big impact on your life early, right? And you saw these movies.
Yeah.
And if you want to talk about something, Phil, go ahead and say it, all right? You don't have to wait for a question.
Yeah, well, as you say, it's kind of a memoir, and it's just about the different ways that film has been a sort of window on the world for me and other people and communities. And as you say, I kind of grew up in a small town that didn't even have a cinema, didn't have a movie theatre for most of my childhood, and that just kind of fueled my interest in movies. So the book's kind of really about the different ways that people kind of access movies and the different ways that movies create a window on the world for somebody like me who grows up in a cultural backwater and has a kind of an interest and a curiosity about the wider world and the way that the cinema does that. So it kind of looks at things like VCRs in the 80s, because I kind of grew up into that. But also other kind of more obscure historical sort of cinema-based sort of phenomena like the film production workshop movement in the UK in the 80s, and regional film theatres and the repertory cinemas, which kind of had a lot of popularity leading up to the 90s, and then they sort of died away, and then they've kind of come back in a big way as well in cities like London and other major cities in England.
Well, I wanted to talk about that a little bit. First of all, you call this a memoir, and I was wondering to myself, is it a memoir? Is it also potentially a textbook of some kind?
I kind of just really wanted to talk about because, my background's pretty diverse, but it's always been about film appreciation. So, I've made films and I've been a film lecturer and written books on films and so on.
Yeah,
but it all comes from this one thing, which is the idea that film has kind of opened the world up for me. So I suppose I'm not a huge fan of the memoir format, but for this book, I thought it was the best way to explore that idea by using myself as the kind of the focus study in a way, and try and broaden it out and talk about how other people have been sort of affected in a similar way to me.
Yeah, you give a lot of things to people, and as you grew up, you developed various increases in interest, and it was fascinating to read about your attempts to make, and you did complete, a Super 8 film. I think you called it a Pollyanna Blue, which you're a pretty tough critic of it, but it was an interesting concept about a man who is become a vagrant due to some misfortunes. He goes to a factory, and eventually he dies. But then you grab something out of David Lynch's Eraserhead for the finish. So that's very inventive to think of those things at that young age.
I guess I was a quite a creative kid, because I was always messing around with tape recorders and stuff like that, and recording little radio shows and that sort of stuff. But I mean the point of talking about that film in the book is to illustrate how making a film is another form of film appreciation, because you learn the language of film. You learn how to put shots together and how editing works, and how camera angles work. So I have no big claims for that film apart from the fact that making a film helped to foster my appreciation of the cinema, and it's a kind of a similar thing for my students over the years as well. Having taught film studies, you know, practical-based film studies, and also kind of academic film studies. But often the practical element in a course like that is like a practical application of learning. So it allows students to kind of explore the language of cinema by making films.
You talk about how you inspire some of your students, and you talk about providing an opportunity in an economically distressed area, potentially even dangerous area. Was it Clapton, where you had students? And you said something very interesting in that book. You said the students really aren't inspired by seeing something that they live, okay, in a film. They're looking for other things, right? So you're kind of broadening their horizons, perhaps, in this sense.
Yeah, I mean that was really something I discovered becoming a teacher. You know, is that, you know, how do you engage your students, which is you know, a big issue that every teacher has to face. And within film studies, what I discovered is if I tried to sort of get down with the kids and show them films about gangsters and stuff like that, and that was, you know, a little bit too close to home for them, they really weren't that interested in having this you know, middle-aged white man come in and sort of show them how it was. But when you put something like Brief Encounter, they're really fascinated, because it's just something that's so far outside of their own experience that it kind of gives them something new, and maybe something that they wouldn't have watched, you know, on their own volition. You know, they wouldn't have chosen to watch it. But something else that kind of illustrates is just how film is like this. You know, I think it was Roger Ebert who said it's like an empathy machine. You know, that somebody in Clapton, in Hackney, can watch a movie about, you know, set in 1940s, sort of upper middle class white England, and they can still empathize with the characters. They still, you know, they still feel, you know, the drama of the characters. And I guess that's another theme that goes through the book, is the idea that one of the reasons we're drawn to the cinema, to see films set in other countries, and films about experiences that are very different to our experiences, it's just it allows us to empathize with some of those, you know, with people around, you know, whose lives are very different to our own, and kind of emphasizes perhaps just how they still have the same feelings that we have, even though could be very different to us. And I think in the beginning of the book, I talk about D.W. Griffith, you know, who's, you know, he's kind of vilified now, but he when he was making movies, he really thought that the cinema would end all wars because of, you know, the ability to provide a kind of a common language of cinema would break down any kind of differences or any misunderstandings. You know, different people of different nationalities, different countries, different languages. He wasn't right, but I think the idea was
a good idea, yeah.
a fair one, you know.
I want to ask you something before we start to talk about the books. You've made two 16mm films. One's called Vision of Angels. The other's called Boxes. And I plan to watch Boxes on YouTube sometime, all right, in the near future. But what was the more valuable experience? Were they both valuable to make, or is there one you favor over the other?
They were both incredibly valuable because, again, it was a kind of a step into a sort of semi-professional realm of making a film with a proper crew, you know, and shooting it on 16mm. And Vision of Angels was very much made by a small group of people, myself and a few friends. But we tried to do it properly, you know, with lighting and a professional camera and professional editing facilities. And these were the days where everything was, you know, before digital editing even. So it was kind of shooting and editing on an old Steenbeck, cutting the film, you know, cutting the film and cutting the sound. And just, it was an incredible learning experience, Visions of Angels, in terms of, you know, figuring out how a camera works, you know, because we had to do everything ourselves. So we had to learn how to load a camera to start with, learn how to use a light meter, you know, and from there we kind of, Visions of Angels was almost kind of like a music video, or it was more like a film to music. And from there kind of stepped up to making a kind of proper sync sound drama in black and white, which was boxes, all kind of set in a caravan, a very confined space, but all very planned out and kind of very professionally mounted, lit by a cinematographer. And so again, an extraordinary kind of learning experience for me and for the other people who were involved in it.
And you also mentioned that in the book you talk about how it took years to find the right ending for boxes, right?
Yeah, I mean, it was one of those things that what it taught me is a lesson I've only come to realize very recently, that some projects can take years, decades until they're finished, And so you'll get a Spielberg who tinkers with Close Encounters, or Coppola who'll tinker with Apocalypse Now, or Blade Runner with Ridley Scott, and you kind of think, why do they keep going back to it? Well, there's that kind of sense that they're trying to get it right. But in the case of boxes, there was never an ending to it, even in the script, because I kind of pulled the script out recently when I was writing Window on the World, and I kind of read through it and I thought, yeah, this is why it didn't work, is because there wasn't an ending in the first place. So when you cut the movie together, it just didn't have that right kind of shape to it. It didn't have the right kind of resolution that the film needed. But we were very inexperienced and didn't realize what was missing. And ultimately, it kind of came to me years later that the movie didn't have an ending, but I realized that I could just shift a few scenes around and put a scene that was in the middle of the film at the end of the film, and that would give the film the ending that I wanted. And I guess, as well as the inexperience, it kind of speaks to just how clunky it used to be back in those days to make a movie, on 16mm, because you really couldn't see what the movie was going to be like. You had to kind of imagine it in your head, because now with digital editing, you can put dissolves in and fades in, and you can change the speed of things, and you can do it all very, very quickly. Whereas, you don't kind of get lost in the process of editing the way that I kind of got lost. It was just like doing a kind of jigsaw puzzle that had pieces missing, and I just didn't know how to finish it. And then a few years after, I kind of put it away and thought, well, that's it. It just doesn't work, And a few years later, I kind of just had this light bulb moment, just in the middle of, doing nothing. It just came to me, and I saw the whole film in my head the way that would work, with this new ending, and also some of the other scenes that hadn't worked the way that I'd originally planned to cut them.
Okay, well, we'll move on, but I just want to recommend that book, Window on the World, because there's so much about it, even though it's a thin book, about 126 pages. And
Yeah.
I didn't even talk about what I wanted to. You made me want to go see the Ford Anglia, and I think it's MGM Studios in Hollywood, Los Angeles, because the flying one from Harry Potter. Because I've never been to those other studios that you talk about in that final chapter of your trip to Hollywood. To me, it's always been Universal. And so that was very valuable too. Well, let's get into the book, 40 Cult Movies. Joe will have some questions too on this one, but this is a book I think was needed for a long time. And how I sense there's a lot of movies in here. Like one is Alice, is it called Alice Sweet Alice? I just watched it recently. Alice Sweet Alice?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Alice, Sweet Alice,
yeah.
a.k.a. Communion 1976.
Where basically it's you mentioned the director got in trouble with the Catholic Church even before, but he's making a movie that has heavy themes of Catholicism, isn't necessarily disrespectful, but how do you think that influences a film like that, which deals with the death of somebody and all this kind of unheard words, and tension within the spirituality of Catholicism and things like that?
Well, I mean, there's just something really that Alfred Soul captures in that film, which is there's a kind of a sense of a kind of a musty community that's almost kind of based around a church, and I'm sure that every city in the Western world has this kind of community where you've got these apartments, and the people in the apartments have got all their apartments are decorated with crucifixes and all the kind of regalia, the bells and smells of Catholicism. And I think that what Soule does really well, and partly it's because he was a brilliant art director, and he did all of the art direction of Alice, Sweet Alice himself, is he really kind of conjures up that feel, of a kind of old Catholicism, and some of the oppression that the religion has kind of exerted on the community, and all of the people are having affairs, and there's secrets within families, there's tensions within families, and so on and so forth. So I'm not sure, is it a negative view or not? I think it's a very sort of like common way that horror movies have shown Catholicism.
Yeah. There are I see themes in some of these chapters. Like we have Martin, which is a movie I love, and I'm glad you included it. Martin is a guy you can't root for because he's killing people, all right? But you still can feel his ability to feel sorry for him at times. And you have the so-called anti-hero of the old man, and I can't recall right now if it's his grandfather or something, but you know what I'm talking about. And he ends up doing something that's horrible, but he's doing it to someone who's doing horrible things. And I think there's some kind of elements of what we talked about in that kind of film also, like that. What do you think of what Romero was doing in that movie?
Well, I think in a way it's a kind of it's a Frankenstein film. It's the monster who really is a kind of product of his environment. That he's kind of been told he's a vampire right from childhood. So what are you going to do? You're going to go out and kill people, aren't you? So he's become, all of his energies have kind of been sublimated into this vampirism. But at the same time, he's kind of like vilified. Rather than trying to understand him, his family just kind of like condemn him. And Cuda, Cuda just kind of, in a way, exercises his own misgivings on Martin, and kind of, and I think what Romero was saying in that film, in a way, was this idea that we pick our demons in order to, in order to exact these horrible punishments on them that actually makes us feel better about ourselves, at the end, whether it's by hanging murderers or, castrating rapists and, whatever it is that we choose to do actually makes us feel better about some of the darker elements of our own personalities.
He almost seems like he was fated to have that happen, Martin. They decided what he was, and he was going to be that. And I wonder if that's that's the allegory of these things are created, which are necessarily very unhealthy.
Yeah,
and everything.
He's almost like a scapegoat for the community in a way. He's the kind of the character who everybody's just going to kind of take it out on, because he's different.
Joe, did you have a question about one of the films right now? Did you want to talk about?
Not really a question, but I was pleased to see Dr. Terrace House of Horrors in here. It's a fun little thing that I saw a while ago.
Yeah. I mean, those Amicus films again, kind of grow up with them. Those are the kind of films that were on television a lot when I was a kid, sort of growing up, and we only had 3 channels of TV. So any horror movie, especially that came on, any movie that came on was a big event. But especially a horror movie, if you're into horror movies, you would really live for those nights of staying up late to watch a Hammer movie, or often an Amicus movie, and those portmanteau movies are always the most fun. Yeah. They weren't scary particularly, but they were just good fun, and you just everyone has a great deal of affection for them. And of course, a lot of them are written by Robert Bloch, who's a great writer in the genre. So yeah, the Psycho author, and they're just got kind of great little stories with twists in the tail and so on and so forth. And I think that portmanteau movies often kind of got slagged off a little bit, because they don't work like normal movies.
Yeah.
You're kind of sitting through 4 or 5 short films. But if you watch them in that spirit, then they're very entertaining.
It's interesting you talk about watching those as a child, because in that book, we're going back to Window on the World, you talk about almost it being like a water cooler thing in school after watching a movie at night. And Joe here, he is an expert on Johnny Sacco, this flying robot. Okay, and the only point I'm going to make is when I was 8, 9 years old, we all watched Voyage into Space, and that's all we talked about in the on the playground the next day. So I kind of resonated when you wrote that in the book.
Yeah, I mean, some people are into, it's whatever art form you're into, that becomes your window on the world. And for some people it's the theatre, some people it's music, especially in small towns. Music is a big thing. It was a big thing in my life. Everybody joined bands. That was a kind of a window on the world as well. Novels, reading, painting for some of my friends. So whatever it was, and for me it was cinema. So I used to try and get all my friends enthusiastic about it. So in the days before VCR, yeah, you kind of stay up late and watch these horror double bills on TV, and then kind of tell all your friends about it, in the schoolyard or in the dinner queue. Because when you're waiting in the dinner queue, it's boring, right? You're kind of just waiting to get served. But it was great because you had a captive audience. So I used to really enjoy just recounting the plots, of the movies. And then, of course, when VCR came in, we used to have video parties because we didn't have a cinema in town at the time. So we just kind of go out and rent 4 or 5 movies and just invite our friends round. We'd kind of like hijack somebody's parents' house for the night, just kind of get people around. And usually it was video nasties. So it would be Lucio Fulci and
We
Ribeiro.
have a video nasty that was filmed in Ogden, Utah here. What was it called again? Don't Go Out in the Woods Alone or something?
Right.
It's a video nasty.
Is that the one with Linnea Quigley in it?
No, I don't think. I think it was too lowbrow for even Quigley.
I'm actually I think I'm picturing the video cover, because that was one of the.
Goes out and kills people. That's all that happens.
It's like a video cover of somebody with dark glasses on in a woods and like a knife or something. I think that was.
Yes, exactly. You got it.
Yeah, that was it. Go out and kill somebody in the woods.
Yeah,
Not exactly the most original.
There are some good video nasties. Like I think Axe is a fantastic movie. All right?
Yeah, when I was sort of 10 years old, I used to collect a magazine called House of Hammer, and it used to have reviews of lots of low-budget horror movies that came out around about 1977, 76, 77, 78, and Axe was one of the ones that had a review, and a lot of the films in 40 Court Movies come out of me collecting that magazine and wanting to see these films like The Redeemer or Alice, Sweet Alice. They were all reviewed in this magazine in such a way that I thought, oh God, I really want to see this film, and I had to wait years till I could see them, probably 5 or 6 years till they came out on video. But Axe was one of the ones I always wanted to see.
It's a creepy little 65-minute movie. It really
Yeah,
is.
yeah.
I also like some Milligan stuff, I think, that fell under the video nasties. I don't want to talk about me too much, but what I like is a film to be unique, that you can't replicate and a director have, and that's something. But there was a movie that I had never watched, always wanted to. You talked about in this movie, Suburbia. And I just thought Suburbia blew my mind away. There were scenes in there, maybe I might have been too squeamish, I wish I hadn't been in there. But I like the idea of making this film in an era, and you talk about this a little bit in Invasion of the Body Snatchers also, in an era of complacency where these kids seem to be misfit, can't fit into it, and are trying to band together. You want to talk more about Suburbia and what do you think about that movie? Because
Yeah, I mean, I think it is a great film, and I think it's, you know, one of Penelope Spheres' best films. It may well be her best film. You know, I think it's one of those films that kind of talks about how rotten society can be to its youngest members. You know, to kids, and in this case, it is the kind of suburban landscape of the 1980s. But it's also the way that they find solace in each other as a kind of a family, you know, and what they're really, and of course they're really into punk, you know, so that's their great love. But I think if that film had subtitles and it had been shot in Brazil, it would probably have won an Oscar, you know, because it's not that different to a film like City of God, you know.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah. So it's kind of taking those same themes about or even Buñuel's film in the 50s, Los Olvidados, set in Mexico, about the slums. It's kind of about slum kids in a way.
Yeah,
you know,
I was going to mention Los Olvidados because you have, in these two films, you have amateur actors who may have lived these parts before they actually did it, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the strengths of Suburbia is the casting. I mean, I think that it's obviously they took a hell of a lot of care in the casting. I think there is probably a mix of amateurs and professionals. But it's like one of those great ensemble movies. And I mean, I always remember the post for it, which kind of, it's that classic shot of the band, the kind of band of brothers and sisters, as it were, walking down a suburban street in a row, kind of like that the Reservoir Dog shot, or a Clockwork Orange shot, you know, that shows the strength in numbers, the strength of the gang. You know, it's them against the world. And I remember that poster. It's such a very powerful and vivid image. And then underneath, just the title Suburbia, you know, and you just know it's a really powerful piece of work just from that sort of key image in the film.
I'm just wondering if there are any films like that today. I saw a film called Men recently, but it was like a woman dealing with one person representing 8 different threatening men or something. But I don't know if there's a Suburbia we have today out there.
You know, I've seen kind of similar films from different countries. There's a Mexican film called I'm trying to remember the title. Something Tigers. Do you know it?
We'll look for it.
Okay. So many titles, you know, I just can't. My brain can't take it.
No, it's an out of left field question. I'm wondering. Hey Joe, go on. I wanted to ask Joe. Do you have another question about a movie in the book?
I don't think any questions. There's a lot of interesting films in here, and even more interesting commentary that I like to read. It was fun to.
Well, we were talking about freaks.
Cool.
Why was it banned for so long, do you think?
In the UK?
Yeah. Was it just people forgot about it, or they just wanted to keep it off the air and things like that?
I think that it was. I think it was a decision made by the British Board of Film Censorship at the time. I think they just found that it was distasteful and kind of exploitative.
Well, it might be considered that today, also, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think I've spoken a lot about that film, but I think one of the things that makes it such a powerful film is it has this real kind of its ambiguity to it. You know, you can see it as a very sympathetic film, but you can also see it as a exploitative film, and those two and it's kind of both of those things at the same time, which makes it a very difficult watch. But I think in terms of the British Board of Film Censorship, it kind of came at that time where a number of horror films were kind of just not being given certificates, you know, mid kind of 1930s, and it just kind of disappeared.
Well, a lot of films disappeared. Like Freaks
Yeah.
disappeared. The Old Dark House, which is a brilliant movie, disappeared for a long time. But Freaks used to have an ending where it ended with her as the, what do they call it, chicken lady, and that's one of the most shocking endings to a film I ever saw as a kid. Now they've tacked on something else when I watched it on Turner Classic Movies, and I guess I want to veer into. Darn it, there's one more film I want to talk about in your book, 40 cult films. So it's called Horror Hospital. I'd never seen it before, and it was just very interesting because it seemed to go both as a youth or a young adult movie, you know, and then a relationship movie, and suddenly they're trying to turn them into zombies or something. And then I recognized Michael Go. What makes that film like a top cult film for you in your book conclusion?
It's such a weird kind of mishmash of
Yeah.
movies, you know, and I think that it's basically a sex farce, but
Yeah, it
also
is.
horror, but also a horror movie, and it's kind of done in a very kind of tongue-in-cheek way. It's not a serious movie at all, and I think it was kind of it was produced pretty much to you know, ride on the coattails of the popularity of other films in those two genres. So Anthony Bouch and the producer, I think it was Richard Gordon, I think they got together and said, let's make a movie that's both a sex film and a horror movie. And Bouch was such a weird kind of character anyway, you know, that anything he made is bound to be
I just watching that
bound to
movie,
be strange.
I'm thinking, is it going to turn into like a Tower of Evil? That's a Gordon film, I think. Or is it going to turn into a Carry On movie? I couldn't figure it out as it's going on.
And it kind of walks the line between both things all the time, all the way through, you know. So it's kind of like a little bit softcore and a lot of nudity, and you know, Robin Asquith in there, who's, you know, more associated with Confessions of a Window Cleaner kind of roles as the cheeky chappy, sex maniac, basically, you know, hippie, and you know, so it's kind of got him in there. So immediately you're kind of thinking, oh, this is a bit strange. I associate him more with TV comedy that's a little bit cheeky and a bit raunchy, kind of seaside postcard humour. But when you kind of dig a little bit deeper, he's also been in low-budget horror movies as well, you know, of that era. So it's not such an unusual casting.
Is there going to be another version of 40 cult movies out there sometime?
Well, I would like to do
volume?
it. I would like to do it. It takes a long time to kind of put together so many essays, but I'm probably halfway there with essays that could fit into a new book. So, of course, it would be called 40 more cult movies.
Well, they have the thing anybody thinks of who knows this genre knows that this is a good addition 40 years later of Perry's books, all right? And he ended up doing 3 of them for they call it cult films. Yeah, I want to mention one more thing about this. You're very heavily influenced by David Cronenberg, and there's at least 3, maybe more. No, 3 in there. And I went and saw Shivers for the first time, thanks to you. Good movie. What kind of impact, what kind of impact do you think that Cronenberg has today? You know, because he went through it. Didn't he win an Academy Award for Crash or something? Am I wrong? Am I blowing it with something?
I mean, his journey has been an interesting one. He's basically gone from being an underground filmmaker.
It's like a John Waters, but not the same thing.
Yeah, almost like an experimental narrative filmmaker that's more akin to the sort of New York underground films of the 60s, and then he went from that into kind of into horror movies, but with a Cronenberg twist, you know, and then from there he's kind of gone into more, I guess you would call art house territory, more of a sort of a cultural hero middle, almost sort of middle brow, but not quite. Is still kind of retained is interest in the kind of the more kind of obscure aspects of culture.
I loved him in it's not called Cabal. What's it called? It's called Nightbreed. I love his
Yeah,
acting in that movie. It's a lot of fun to watch. You know, it's
he's also
interesting. Oh,
he's also got, I think it's got a little part in Into the Night, the
yeah.
John Landis movie. I think he's in that as well. So yeah, he's popped up, hasn't he?
Well, you know, it reminds me of how old I am that I see Cronenberg's son making movies now. He made Infinity Pool, I think, and so
Yeah,
it's
and Possessor.
and
Yeah.
Possessor too. Very good. So, what decade do you think? And this is a hard question, I understand. Or maybe it isn't. Were the best films?
What, in terms of the cult of cult movies in the
Yeah, I
context
guess
of
in cult
40
movie,
cult
or maybe
movies?
cinema if you want to. The 70s, 80s.
Yeah, I guess the idea of the cult film probably really flowered in the late 60s, with the kind of midnight movie phenomenon, films like Night of the Living Dead and so on. Those kind of movies that wouldn't necessarily have a huge mainstream audience, but they would appeal to a kind of alternative audience, people who might go to the drive-in or go to late night movie shows, or student audiences. So there'd be those kind of movies in the late 60s. And then, of course, you've got people like Jodorowsky making movies in the early 70s, and those kind of El Topo and movies like that. Those became big cult hits. And then, David Lynch with films like Eraserhead in the 70s. So I guess there are some movies that kind of started out as cult movies and always become cult movies. And then there are probably other movies like Last House on the Left and so on that started out as kind of low budget exploitation movies and have taken on more of a kind of cult mantle in more recent years. But which era? Yeah, probably the late 60s, early 70s, but also a lot of movies in the 80s, a lot of in the kind of late 80s. I see cropping up all the time. Troma really kind of came into their own in the sort of late 80s, mid to late 80s.
Well, I remember seeing. I sort of missed out. I was too young in the 70s, but I remember going to films like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre at midnight and things like that. And El Topo, even as late as the 80s.
Yeah,
And Aguirre, The Wrath of God, was another film that was popular for a
yeah.
while.
And so you need a venue that be willing to be willing to put together those kind of treble bills
They're
of
dying out here. We just had a place down the road that closed after years that played nothing but repertory movies.
yeah, exactly, but repertory movies with a cult sort of emphasis, I guess in terms of my own movie going, the kind of cult interest went through sort of 2 or 3 different phases. When I was able to get access to these movies, the first phase was really sort of the rise of the VCR in the early 80s, especially before the Video Recordings Act kind of banned a lot of horror movies in the UK. So I got to see a lot of cult movies then. But later, when I was kind of in my early 20s, and I think I talk about this in Window on the World a little bit, I used to go to a lot of rep cinemas in London because I was living in London. So I was able to go to places like the Scala, which has become, very celebrated as a venue of cult movies. So I used to spend a lot of time there in the Scala and
Well,
in the late 80s, early 90s, and that's where I saw films like Tetsuo the Iron Man for the first
good movie.
time, or Henry Portrait of the Serial Killer. I saw that for the first time at the Scala when
We
it
have a
was
thing in
first
Salt
came
Lake
out.
that has repertory movies. I saw Henry there. Hated one
Yeah,
scene in it, to be honest, but good movie.
yeah,
These guys right here, and I'm not being condescending, but they look for movies by going into our Xfinity set and just going through every free movie. They don't understand what it's like to go to a Blockbuster and to spend 2 hours there, or also going to these smaller VCR places and seeing the John Waters section or the Andy Milligan section. And sure, you can find them on Tubi now, but at least you were looking for them back then.
I've been to one Blockbuster. Thank you very much.
The one blockbuster. Okay. Well, let's just talk a little bit, Joe. Unless you have something to add about 40 cult movies, I want to go to this. I want to go to the pre-code era of horror, and your book, The Turn to Gruesomeness, because you make a very provocative argument, which really had me thinking, and I think it makes you have a pretty good point. You said that the films of that era, and you cited things like Murders in the Rue Morgue or Death, and you may not, the movies like Doctor what's it called,
Dr.
X,
X.
stuff like that. Yeah. And so in Freaks, you said they were actually more grisly, or at least had more grisly themes than films in our era today, but they were masked by the fact that they had happy endings or they had wisecracking reporters or things like that. Could you expound more on that?
Yeah, it's not so much they were more grisly, but it's just that the films of the 30s, the pre-code films, my contention is that they're more comparable to the modern horror films than they are comparable to the 1940s Universal movies, and there was, a number of critics had started to lump together the 1930s horror movies with the 1940s horror movies and kind of came up with this sort of template or schema for what a Universal that era horror movie was, that it would always have a happy ending and that the horror would be off screen, and it was more shadows and suggestion than sort of graphic horror. But actually, when I kind of looked into it historically, I found that wasn't the case, and I think that, that a lot of writers do tend to kind of just repeat what other writers have said, and I felt that is what had happened with analysis of the classic horror movies of the 1930s is that that actually some of the better critics were the historians who would actually go back to the primary sources. People like Gary Rhodes, who's a wonderful film historian and a critic. He'll actually go back to the original scripts and go back to looking at what was being said in the newspapers at the time, in order to kind of extrapolate what was really going on in the genre then. So that's kind of what I tried to do with the Turn to Gruesomeness, was to go back to those primary sources, and the main sources were, the scripts of the films themselves and the correspondence between the studios and the censors, and actually what
the Breens, right?
the Breen and the kind of pre-Breen era, and actually what and what I found was that the birth of the horror movie, as it were, or when the films were first started to be called horror movies in the 1930s, at the same time those films were being referred to as gruesome movies, and that was really the characteristic of the early 1930s horror movies, is the gruesomeness, and that was the word that kept coming up again and again in the correspondence between the studios and the censors, the Production Code Administration, and as you say, the Breen administration. So those movies, they were made at the time when it was the days of the Great Depression, and it was actually hard to get people into theatres because people didn't have any money. So how do you get them in? Well, sex and violence, So you'd have the gangster movies with machine guns. You'd have Jean Harlow as with sex movies, and with horror movies you'd have gruesomeness. So you would have movies like Murders in the Rue Morgue, where Bela Lugosi's like crucifying a prostitute on screen, and that's pretty shocking.
Well, I think you write in the book that John Balderston had really big plans for Dracula's daughter that didn't.
Yeah, because Balderston basically said, look, we got to take it even further, and I want S&M in the movies. And he's saying what people really want to see is Dracula's daughter beating on her victims with chains and whips, And he wrote that in a letter to the studio and said, that's what I'm going to do. But unfortunately for us, that was the time when the Breen administration was starting to say, hold on a minute, this is going too far now with these horror movies, and we need to start clamping down on what's allowable.
Well, it ended up with Bela Lugosi getting paid $5,000 for doing nothing in Dracula's Daughter, right?
Yeah, exactly, because they just kept rewriting the script.
I love the movie The Walking Dead with Boris Karloff, but after reading your book, I'm wondering how would it have been different had there had been the Breen era?
It could have been, but by the time that film was written, the studios were playing along with the Production Code Administration because they really didn't have any choice, because countries like the UK were starting to slap H certificates on horror movies and even talking about banning them, and when a country starts wanting to ban films, then economically it doesn't make any sense to keep making them because the market gets cut off, So by the time the Walking Dead came round, they were thinking of new ways of taking the horror film. So in some ways it was a positive development, because without the Production Code Administration, we might not have had Val Lewton movies, and we might not have had film noir or movies where the horror became more psychological. And filmmakers might not have explored those areas as much if they could have just kept churning out movies that had a kind of a gruesome shock appeal to them.
You may disagree with what I'm going to say here, but maybe not. How could Val Lewton and RKO make these wonderful movies like Cat People or The Seventh Victim, and Universal came out with She-Wolf of London? Okay, I'm just trying to figure what had happened in that time period.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there may well there've been personnel changes at Universal around about the late 30s and into the 40s, and horror movies were just seen as B-movie product, and that's really all they were seen as. So the more it really didn't matter how classy the story was. They just thought that horror movies were a niche product, and that went on well into the 50s, with Universal.
Certainly seemed like they lost steam after the early 40s or something, Universal, and they had people pick it up. I just want to mention one more time that there's a movie, I was watching it again. It's Frederick March in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. To me, it's a total blend of pre-code horror, and then there's a scene between him as the doctor, and I can't remember her name. It's Miriam Hopkins.
Yeah.
It's probably the most erotic scene I've seen in a pre-code movie, and it's blended in with this horror film. And I don't know if I read it in your book, but I read about how the censors back then would send constant admonitions of what to do, and they actually were ignored at that time period for a while. The studios would just ignore them.
Yeah, I mean, the production code wasn't enforced as rigorously as it was under Breen. So when you get something like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which had quite a cachet to it, it was a big studio, Paramount, I think, a very well-respected director with Mamoulian, Frederick March, big star. It was a classy production, so they could get away with a lot. And Jason Joy, who was the guy who was kind of in charge of what became the Production Code Administration, they could only make really suggestions, and the studio might choose to go with some of those suggestions and not go with others. But what happened to Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is what happened to a lot of pre-code horror movies after 1935, that if they were going to be if they were going to be shown again, if they're going to be re-released, they'd have to go in front of the tightened up production code administration, who did start cutting things out of them that weren't that were allowed through the first time round, you know, and some of those films were declined to have a production code seal, so they couldn't be shown. So they were censored in the late 30s, where they weren't censored in the early 30s. And the prints that went into history until we had the age of restoration were those cut prints.
Well,
So
Frankenstein was cut a long time.
Exactly,
right?
which is the classic case. So, you know, no wonder that film writers and academics didn't really see how gruesome those films were, because they were cut. The gruesome scenes were cut out of them, so the evidence wasn't there, and it only became more apparent, you know, in the age of the DVD and so on, with restoration work being done on those films.
I remember being shocked to hear Bela Lugosi groan in Dracula at the end, because I had never heard it when I was younger.
Yeah, which, you know, the groan was taken out during the re-release. So it'd be, you know, you didn't even know what happened to him, whether he'd been killed or not, you know.
Hey, before we wrap up, can I ask you about one film in this book right here, 40 Cult Movies? Hold it up, Joe, so people can see it. You've done a good job marketing this, I've noticed, on social media and things. And people should buy this. He occasionally has sales for it, but buy it anyways, okay, if it isn't on sale. But there's a movie that I loved for years and told people about, and they said, "Oh, I can't ever. This movie's never on TV or anything." It was called The Legend of Hell House. Love that movie. Absolutely love it. I love the scene at the very end where he exposes. Is it Michael Gough is in there? I can't remember the character that's in there. He finds him, the villain, oh, not the villain, the ghost. But what impressed you about this movie, Legend of Hell House?
You know, I mean, the thing that really impressed me about it was how well directed it was. John Hoff, you know, and he written by Richard Matheson, and Matheson wanted to do something that was different to Shirley Jackson's Haunting of Hill House. So he wrote that as a kind of riposte to Hill House, and he wrote the screenplay, but he didn't actually like the finished film, you know. And when I first saw the film as a kid, it didn't really stay with me. Legend of Hell House didn't really stay with me. But it's only when I kind of saw it again a few years ago, and I just thought it was so well directed, you know, just the way that Hoff uses the camera, very, very atmospheric, and he directs Roddy McDowall in it really well, and Roddy McDowall gives a fantastic performance in it as well.
Yeah, he seems to be somebody who thinks he's going to probably die, all right, but he survives because he understands how dangerous things are. Where the scientist, I can't remember the actor, I'm sorry, but he doesn't sense the danger. And what is the actress's name who gives an excellent performance as the spiritual medium? You'll have to forgive me here, but she's just a little too naive to survive that. It's quite, but she gives the final clue. I just love that movie, and I'm glad you included it.
It's a really interesting film, and you know, I think it's one that they should be remade, and it could make a really good TV series as well.
Yeah, I wonder. There's a lot of stuff going on in streaming now, right?
Yeah.
I have a friend who's written a book of the ill-fated actress, biography of Barbara Payton, and he's working with an Irish what do you call it, screenwriter, to try to sell it, and they're thinking. Not just a movie, now they're thinking, can they sell it as an 8-parter on Netflix or something, you know? So that's a change in how films come now.
Exactly.
Everything. Well, let me just ask you, what are some things going on for you in the future, do you think, right now, some projects?
Well, the main thing is getting Window on the World out, and that's scheduled to come out in September. And you mentioned the film boxes, that's kind of been restored and digitized, so that's going to get its first public showing in about 35 years, in about a month's time. So that's going to kind of appear at the same time as the book.
Now, is it still on YouTube? I'll watch it later tonight.
It's not on YouTube yet. I'm holding it back until the publication.
I'm reading a book that's not out yet. Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
I get to do that a lot sometimes. I will. I'll look for it in the fall then. And
Cool.
is there anything else, or have we covered enough
Uh,
for you?
I'm very happy with what we've done.
Okay, we really
And
appreciate
just say, thanks very much for inviting me on to Plan
maybe
9 Crunch.
yeah, maybe we'll have the opportunity to do it again sometime, particularly
I hope so.
when maybe we can talk about boxes or something. Yeah, we're
Cool.
Plan9Crunch. I have to do this spiel right now, of course. We're at YouTube. Give us a subscribe if you can. It doesn't cost any money. We're on Facebook. I think we're called Plan9Crunch Podcast and Blog on Facebook. The blog, which we've had since 2008, and my co-blogger who he sells art on Saturdays, so he has a busy schedule. His name is Steve D. Stones. He wanted to say hi to you, okay? Because he also owns 40 cult movies and loved it.
Oh, cool.
Right.
That's excellent.
Okay, and we're
Really,
on.
it's holding the book up again.
We're on TikTok also, and we appreciate this, John. Thanks very much for your time, and that's a wrap.